we begin our examination at a corner of modern life. Observe the flow here. This street corner, this bustling confluence of lives, is a perpetual theater built upon assumptions and hurried expectations. We watch people passing each other, moving in parallel lines that occasionally intersect with sharp, minor friction. The annoyance we feel, the sudden lurching into a gap, the volume suddenly raised above all reason, the impatient glance thrown across a crowd. These moments are small irritations by cosmic measure. Yet, they possess the power to disrupt our inner equilibrium entirely. We are accustomed to treating social interaction as if it were an equation with predictable variables. We assume that when we follow the rules, others will do the same. We expect punctuality. We anticipate consideration. We rely upon a shared, invisible contract of mutual respect. When this contract is breached, when the line jacker cuts through the queue, or the phone call monopolizes every single inch of available air, the resulting surge of irritation feels profoundly justified. It feels like a violation not just of social etiquette, but of universal law. We internally rail against the perceived injustice. But what if this feeling of justice is itself predicated on a catastrophic error in judgment? What if our expectation that others should behave according to our asterisk internalized script is precisely where the deepest philosophical entrapment resides? The source of our discomfort rarely lies with the other person. Rather, it festers within the structure of our own belief system. This is the illusion of control. For too long, we have treated life like a poorly run machine whose components, the individuals around us, are supposed to operate smoothly and logically, all according to our specifications. When one gear slips, or when one cog grinds against another with unnecessary friction, we panic. We assign blame, and in doing so, we transfer the ownership of our peace to unpredictable external forces. This impulse to manage others, to dictate their proper comportment, is exhausting. It is a ceaseless expenditure of mental energy spent wrestling with factors entirely outside the perimeter of our personal domain. The Stoics, notably Epictetus, provided one of the clearest and most brutal deconstructions of this fallacy, that there are things up to us, and there are things not up to us. This dichotomy is not merely an academic exercise. It is a complete reorientation of the axis upon which we mount our personal happiness. The fact that a stranger acts carelessly while crossing our path, that belongs to their free will, their moment of distraction, their transient lack of awareness. It cannot be commandeered by our desire for order or precision. To dwell on what is not up to us is the definition of self-inflicted mental torture. Our rage at the inconsiderate passerby is not fueled by the passing itself. It is fueled by the desperate, irrational demand that they should have been otherwise. We are upset not because of their actions, but because their actions reveal a perceived failure in reality, a deviation from our preferred model of order. Consider the internal debate. Do I feel angry at this person, or am I angry at my own inability to accept imperfection? The shift in perspective is subtle, yet devastatingly powerful. It moves us away from being victims of external circumstance toward becoming masters of internal response. Our power resides solely within the space between stimulus and reaction. This understanding requires a radical acceptance, a difficult resignation to the fundamental chaotic nature of humanity. We must accept that people are inherently unreliable mechanisms. They will deviate, they will forget, they will be selfish when we need them to be generous, and they will misunderstand us even when our words were perfectly clear. This is not an endorsement of recklessness. It is a cold recognition of human fallibility, treated with the detachment of a philosopher observing ants building a temporary mound. The challenge, then, is to redirect the colossal intellectual energy we spend futilely trying to perfect the outer world back into cultivating the inner citadel. If my peace depends on someone else's predictable goodness, then my peace is held hostage, and no one, not even philosophy itself, can guarantee that they will keep paying the ransom. We are not calling for emotional numbness. Rather, we are striving for robust indifference to the outcomes of others. This means recognizing their failure, their lapse in judgment, or their irritating habit as merely data points about their own flawed existence. It is simply an observation. There is that moment again. There is no accompanying moral judgment, only detached acknowledgement. This process feels alien at first glance. The default setting of the human mind is to seek control, to assign meaning, and when something is irritating or baffling, we scramble immediately to find a culprit and demand redress. To simply observe without intervening, without internal protest, requires a strenuous mental discipline. It asks us to exchange the instant gratification of righteous anger for the deep, quiet satisfaction of self-mastery, to realize that true freedom does not come from changing the world around you, but from fundamentally recalibrating your relationship with its inevitable chaos. We stand now at the precipice of our irritation. We have seen how easily the modern world can trip us up, the cut in line, the unexpected delay, the careless word that lands with a heavy, undeserved blow. In these moments, we feel an immediate heat rise in the chest, a fierce demand for things to be ordered, predictable, and precisely according to our inner script. We resent it not because of what happened, but because the event shattered the beautiful architecture of expectation we had so carefully erected around ourselves. The prevailing wisdom suggests simply be nice or let it go. But this advice is a superficial palliative for a deep structural failure. It asks us to mask our true emotional labor with saintly feigned calm. To truly master annoyance, we must not simply sweep the uncomfortable feelings under the rug. We must locate its foundation and methodically dismantle it. This requires moving beyond polite resignation into genuine intellectual surgery. The root cause of this constant, low-grade internal friction is profoundly simple: faulty judgment about external variables. We confuse what asterisk is asterisk with what we desperately wish asterisk it were asterisk. Our annoyed reaction is not a pure signal warning us that someone has wronged us. It is a complex composite alarm sounding because our assumptions, our personal laws governing how others must behave, or even how we ourselves must react in specific circumstances, have been violated. We are judging not the action itself, but the failure of the action to meet the standard set by our internal tribunal. Consider this: every moment of profound vexation you experience when dealing with another human being is merely a feedback mechanism telling you that your control has wandered into territory designated for someone else. It tells you that you have mistakenly attempted to enforce causality upon the capricious nature of humanity. Epictetus taught us that our freedom resides solely in the citadel of our assent, and therefore, every time we feel that flare of annoyance, we must immediately ask ourselves a surgical question: am I bothered by what happened? Or am I bothered by the fact that what happened defies my expectation? The distinction is everything. The architecture of annoyance is built entirely upon pillars of should. We assume people asterisk should asterisk listen when spoken to. We believe they asterisk should asterisk prioritize our needs in a given moment. We expect them asterisk to understand asterisk the nuance of suffering without us having to explain it fully. These foundational shoulds are not moral laws. They are merely habits of mind, sticky, predictable errors we make in drafting the user manual for human existence. To deconstruct these expectations is thus not an act of nihilism or resignation. It is an act of radical cognitive liberation. It means acknowledging that people do not operate on our emotional economy, and their motivations are far more convoluted, often petty, and frequently self-serving than the orderly citizens we wish them to be. The struggle here feels counterintuitive. We expect effort. We demand that others meet us halfway, emotionally or practically. When they fail, we recoil into judgment, but true tranquility arrives only when we accept that their internal landscape is a mystery beyond our jurisdiction, and their actions are ultimately unscripted performances determined by forces, be it fear, ignorance, fleeting impulse, or simple inattention, that have nothing to do with the inherent worth of your peace. This insight requires developing an intellectual disdain for one's own faulty logic. It means seeing that when someone irritates us, we are often reacting less to their fault and more to our own vulnerability being exposed by it. Their sloppiness reflects not just on them, but on the rigidity of our internal standards. We become self-correcting cynics, gently mocking the very mechanism that has caused our pain. The great luxury, the philosophical gift, is the ability to treat human imperfection not as a personal affront, but as predictable entropy, as merely another force in the physical world, like friction or like gravity. It simply exists and requires a method of working around it. We must shift from demanding that humanity achieve an impossible state of perfect adherence to our will, towards mastering the exquisite art of living simultaneously with deep certainty and profound tolerance. This intellectual journey is perhaps more challenging than any physical feat. It asks us to dismantle deeply ingrained patterns, the satisfying catharsis of righteous complaint, the momentary satisfaction of being right, to accept that the world operates on a basis of imperfect causality, where effort does not guarantee outcome, and genuine connection often arises from messy misunderstanding. This is the quiet revolutionary act, refusing to let external reality dictate your internal peace. We have spent time understanding the architecture of annoyance, discovering that much of our frustration is not a reaction to others' actions, but rather to the rigid scaffolding of expectations we erect around them. We assume they must behave according to an invisible script written by polite society, or perhaps by us ourselves. But life, as history and human nature teach us, refuses to adhere to any neatly printed curriculum. It is messy, unpredictable, and profoundly indifferent to our desires for order. To live well in the modern forum, therefore, requires more than mere tolerance. It demands a fundamental change in our relationship with unpredictability itself. We must become comfortable with chaos, realizing that the perceived slight, the cutting of line, the careless word, the missed commitment is not an indictment of character, but merely a symptom of humanity's intrinsic entropy. This brings us to the concept of the inner citadel, the fortress of the self. When external events attempt to breach its walls, when disappointed expectation sends tremors through our composure, we must have already practiced defense. A philosopher does not wait for an attack to learn swordsmanship. They drill endlessly in the quiet solitude until the motions become second nature. The greatest challenge presented by others is that their failures are usually stranger, more inventive, and less predictable than anything we can imagine ourselves. They do not fall according to our personal narrative arc. Marcus Aurelius understood this. He was surrounded by courts, politics, flattery, betrayal, and the constant weight of empires, a continuous onslaught of disappointing reality. His philosophy taught him that his inner self must be an unconquered territory, immune to the political gusts or the fickle whims of popularity. If we are to master annoyance, we cannot afford to wait for it to happen. Much like a soldier does not wait for battle to learn defensive formation, we must engage in mental rehearsal. This is the art of Premeditatio Malorum, the premeditation of evils. But do not mistake this from mere gloom or pessimism. It is a discipline of cognitive preparation, an inoculation against shock. We are going to apply negative visualization, but instead of focusing solely on material loss, losing our coin, losing our home, we will practice it upon the brittle and fragile connections we call relationships. We must consciously picture disappointment itself, not just the sadness that follows, but the specific moment of failure. Picturing a friend abandoning a trust, visualizing a colleague acting purely out of self-interest when we least expect it, anticipating the precise jab of criticism from someone whose opinion we value highly. This exercise is designed to strip away the emotional shock factor. When you mentally rehearse the sting, the disappointment, the misunderstanding, the petty betrayal, you treat it as a familiar draft coming through an already opened window. It loses its sudden power, its capacity to derail the entire afternoon or ruin a week's contemplation. Most people tend to expect stability and predictability from those around them. They assume that good intentions equal consistent actions. But history proves this assumption fatally flawed. The man who swore loyalty yesterday might profit by abandoning you tomorrow. The friend who listened intently today might share the gossip about you next month. This is merely the random oscillation of human will, driven not by moral law, but by self-preservation and immediate gratification. To achieve true emotional resilience, we must therefore dismantle these expectation structures systematically. We are not resigning ourselves to cynicism. Rather, we are adopting a radically clear sight. It is seeing reality as it is asterisk, stripped bare of the soothing myths we tell ourselves about how people should be. The question then shifts. When disappointment arrives, when that loved one fails, when that acquaintance disappoints, when society judges unjustly, does your internal judgment falter? Do you treat the slight as an anomaly, or do you allow it to become a definition of self-worth? The goal is to treat their momentary failure as informational. It tells you nothing about who you are, only what they lacked in character at that specific moment. Imagine the Roman official who was unjustly criticized before Emperor Hadrian, a man whose reputation was attacked purely by envious rivals seeking advancement through your downfall. His response was not to defend his honor with passion or retribution, but to retreat into a disciplined inner life. He recognized that while public opinion is like smoke, constantly shifting and never settling on a fixed shape, internal virtue remains solid ground. The true measure of character, he understood, is not maintained in times of praise, for flattery requires little self-control, but during the sustained acid wash of disappointment. It is when you are forced to accept that people will be irritating, inconsistent, and sometimes actively harmful, yet your inner peace remains undisturbed. This detachment is not coldness. It is sovereignty. It is drawing a clear line between the emotional turbulence generated by others and the sacred space of your own mind. You cannot control their actions. You can only police your response to them. And in policing that response, in choosing calm acceptance over reactive indignation, you reclaim the one thing worth defending: your ability to judge rightly, regardless of the noise outside. We have spent time understanding the architecture of our own annoyance, realizing that most of the sting does not come from the careless act of another, but from the rigid scaffolding of expectation we build inside ourselves. We learned to recognize those self-imposed rules, the unspoken shoulds, about how people ought to behave, and accept them as nothing more than delightful delusions. But cognitive liberation alone is a cold exercise. It can feel abstract, an academic dismantling of human frailty. The true work of the Stoic heart requires immersion. It demands seeing these principles lived out under the relentless, bright spotlight of real life. We must move beyond mere theory and into the crucible of public scrutiny. The philosopher's greatest danger is often that he becomes merely decorative, a thoughtful voice confined to an ivory tower. He may understand Epictetus perfectly, yet falter when confronted by a mob, or endure a day of petty malice from the very people whose opinion he sought to ignore. How does one maintain inner peace when the stakes are public? When reputation is currency, and criticism feels like a physical blow. This brings us to the precarious position exemplified by Seneca, the man who knew the cost of speaking truth in Rome. To be visible, to occupy space within the grand theater of civic life, is to sign up for constant review. The fickle nature of public opinion, we learn, is perhaps the most potent and deceptive force known to man. The pursuit of virtue, when practiced publicly, inevitably becomes entangled with politics, wealth, and expectation. We find that even those who preach radical internal freedom often suffer external consequences: arrest, censure, ostracism. The criticism heaped upon a figure like Seneca was rarely about his philosophical sincerity. It concerned the shifting alliances, the perceived threat to power, or perhaps simply the sheer discomfort of being reminded that some ideals resist commodification. The Roman public craves narrative consistency. They want their heroes predictable, their villains safely categorized. And when an individual lives by a philosophy that refuses easy categorization, a philosophy built on the premise that inner law supersedes outer reward, they become profoundly inconvenient to others. Consider the subtle sting of public disagreement. It is not merely a factual critique. It is often an emotional projection. An opponent does not accuse you of flawlessness. They accuse you of inadequacy, designed to shake your foundational belief in yourself. And because we are wired for social validation, because our ancestors understood that survival depended on acceptance by the tribe, This criticism feels uniquely painful, suggesting a fundamental rejection rather than merely a disagreement. The wisdom gleaned from these historical examples is not found in self-pity, nor in defensive withdrawal. Withdrawal is easy. It requires only physical distance. True Stoicism demands engagement. It demands standing fast within the very arena that attempts to diminish you, and this leads us to the crucial realization regarding reputation. Our status of man must be defined by his relationship with truth and reason, not by the shifting winds of favor. The emperor's approval meant little if the soul was impoverished. The crowd's applause was fleeting dust against the enduring weight of character. The lesson is one of extreme internal focus, a disciplined turning away from the external chorus when faced with public condemnation, whether it comes in the Senate or whispered through the halls of polite society. The mind must perform an immediate triage. Is this criticism aimed at who I am or merely what others fear me to represent? It is rarely the former. By mastering this separation, we do more than just endure hardship. We transform it into a pedagogical tool. Every slight, every public rebuke becomes a moment of forced introspection, an opportunity to reaffirm the inviolability of our internal judgment. Seneca himself knew that the highest price one could pay for virtue was not in coin or comfort, but in the very dignity of one's refusal to compromise core principle. Thus, when you feel the heat rising from public opinion, that uncomfortable, suffocating pressure to conform, to apologize, to soften your edges just enough to gain favor, remember this historical resonance. Do not let the narrative written by others become the syllabus for your own life. Guard that internal space with fierce determination. For in the enduring silence between an accusation and your measured response lies the true measure of the self. We have spent considerable time examining the origins of our irritation, finding that most annoyance is not an accurate response to external reality, but rather a profound conflict with our own expectations. The impulse to demand order from others' chaotic lives, to assume they should behave predictably, rationally, and in a manner that validates our own inner peace, is perhaps the greatest delusion we carry. The challenge now moves beyond mere theory. We must learn a discipline of moment-by-moment detachment. To react wisely requires not only philosophical understanding, but an entirely different neurological circuit, a pause between stimulus and response that allows us to reclaim our sovereignty. This is the discipline of cooling the judgment itself. Think of your most irritating interaction. Perhaps it was a casual slight, a dismissive remark in passing, or a consistent pattern of disregard for your time or feelings. In the heat of the moment, the primary impulse is twofold: defensive outrage and immediate counterattack. We seize upon what has been done to us as evidence of our fundamental wrongness, a confirmation that we are fundamentally flawed observers living in an unmanaged world. But Marcus Aurelius taught us that the most profound mistake of the rational mind is reacting from a place of emotional depletion, allowing transient anger or wounded vanity to dictate the narrative. To cool the judgment means forcing yourself into a meditative pause, transforming the impulsive reaction into a deliberate intellectual process. It requires labeling the raw emotional energy before acting on it. It begins with recognizing the physical manifestation of irritation, the tightening in the chest, the rising heat behind the eyes, the shallow quickening of breath. These are physiological alerts warning that your sophisticated mind is about to yield control to the primitive limbic system. The first act of virtue, then, is noticing this pattern to observe the onset of anger without participating in it. When the slight occurs, do not immediately formulate a rebuttal or search for perceived malice. Instead, mentally force yourself into stillness. Breathe, and with that breath, ask yourself 3 questions. 1. What am I assuming about their motive? 2. And critically, would this assumption be provable in its entirety, by facts alone, divorced from my feeling of being wronged? 3. Whom do I imagine them to be right now? Merely another flawed, fleeting human consciousness navigating a complex entropy. The answers to these questions are almost invariably unsatisfying. They reveal that the narrative of your hurt is not grounded in objective reality, but in an elaborate story you have constructed inside your own head about how things ought to have been. We mistake our desired order for actual law. This cooling technique is quite simply a sophisticated act of cognitive separation. It forces the intellect, reason, to take physical precedence over the gut, instinct, emotion. You are not merely delaying anger, you are suspending your entire judgmental apparatus until reason can intervene and audit the data. Consider the profound difficulty of this work. When we are irritated, our brains become highly efficient machines for confirmation bias. We seek out proof that validates our existing feeling. They were rude, therefore they are a bad person. They are unreliable, therefore they cannot be trusted. Cooling the judgment means actively fighting your own neurological inclination toward simplification and moral outrage. Furthermore, we must apply a kind of radical humility here. We often judge others based on an imagined standard of perfect virtue, the standards we set for ourselves when alone with our thoughts. But Marcus understood that people are caught in the ceaseless current of their own obligations, fear, exhaustion, and ignorance. The person who cuts the line might be rushing to a crisis. The friend whose comment wounds you may simply lack the vocabulary to express complex affection or apology. To deploy this cooling technique is to treat every perceived slight not as an indictment of your worth, but as a fleeting artifact, a snapshot of another person's current psychological disorder. It is treating their folly with philosophical pity rather than emotional fury. This shift from judgment to understanding is perhaps the most difficult climb in the entire edifice of wisdom. The goal is therefore not simply resignation. It is an engaged indifference, not the blank apathy of a statue, but the deep, internal stability of the mountain that has seen countless seasons change, yet remains rooted by its own unshakable geology. It is understanding that your inner citadel must be fortified against both external assault and internal narrative collapse. When you find yourself annoyed again, when the urge to correct, condemn, or lash out arises, do not fight it with force of will alone. Meet it instead with profound cognitive detachment. Label the emotion. I am feeling irritation because my expectation was violated. And then observe that violation as a natural occurrence in human existence. It is merely evidence of entropy at work, nowhere near enough to derail your self-respect or compromise the tranquility you are striving to build. We have spent these chapters deconstructing the targets of our annoyance. We learned that much of what wounds us is not truly external, but merely the echo of faulty judgments within us, a reverberation caused by shattered expectations or a misplaced sense of entitlement. Yet, philosophy often risks becoming an exercise in pure abstraction, trapped between the scroll and the academic lecture hall. Today, we must execute a necessary shift. We are no longer analyzing the fault lines of human behavior. We are stepping back to observe them from a greater distance. We are going to become the spectator to our own emotional drama. The modern mind is wired for participation. When something annoying happens, when someone cuts in line, or when words are spoken with casual cruelty, we feel compelled to engage. We rush forward, reaching out with frustration, needing to fix the imbalance or force an apology. But what if we considered this ingrained impulse a kind of voluntary intellectual cage? What if true power lay not in engaging, but in observing the performance? The goal here is to achieve radical psychological detachment, to inhabit the role of the unbiased witness. Consider life itself as a magnificent, messy amphitheater. At one end, petty arguments flare up. Another spot witnesses profound acts of kindness that fade before dawn. And everywhere, people are struggling with appetites, with insecurities, with the gravitational pull toward self-deception. When we view humanity through this lens, those daily irritations begin to lose their sharp, piercing edge. They become merely background noise. The man who loudly recounts his trivial victory becomes a character study in superficiality. The quarrelsome couple devolves into a predictable cycle of accusation and retreat. We are watching the human comedy, and it is often quite absurd. This process requires us to realize that most interpersonal suffering exists not because the events are catastrophic, but because we have already assigned them profound significance within our personal narrative. When we assign meaning, we become deeply invested. When we withdraw that assumption of significance, the event becomes merely data, a piece of information about human entropy. It is nothing more. Think of it as constructing an inner viewing gallery for your own consciousness. You are not the protagonist in every scene you witness, nor are you obligated to be the resolution to every petty conflict on the street corner. By observing our thoughts, our fleeting judgments, and even the reactions of those around us, we create a necessary gap between stimulus and response, the space where wisdom resides. This is not merely about disinterest. It is about refined appreciation for reality as it presents itself. The world will always be chaotic, inherently unpredictable, driven by impulses that defy rational decree. We cannot change the chaos, but we can radically adjust our relationship to it. Imagine this. You are sitting in a bustling marketplace, the sensory overload of humanity at its peak. People bump into you, shouting vendors compete with clanging metals, and every interaction is framed by minor perceived slights. The instinctual response is tension. The internal monologue is a series of shoulds directed outward. But the observer self steps forward, slightly removed. He does not judge the commotion as inherently offensive, but simply registers it. Sound reached level 7. Person B executed movement C. Emotion D was displayed by individual E. This distancing technique pulls us out of the emotional immediacy and anchors us back in neutral description. It transforms a perceived attack into a predictable human action. When you can view another person's folly, their boastfulness, their misplaced anger, their dramatic outburst, as simply an inevitable byproduct of limited perception, the power they wield over your internal state dissolves. The greatest luxury granted by this detachment is the freedom to judge only your own judgment. You are the sovereign court in which you must adjudicate every emotional impulse before it passes from thought to action. Is this outrage necessary? Does anger truly serve a purpose beyond temporary self-agitation? Is this disappointment rooted in fact or merely in the script I wrote for another person's adherence to my expectations? This observer stance suggests a profound shift. We are not here to fix humanity, but to maintain our own integrity amid its beautiful mess. To recognize that the human experience is fundamentally one of minor, recurring failures, a continuous loop of misplaced affection and disappointment, and recognizing this universal truth transforms potential anger into quiet philosophical pity. The lesson whispered by history's greatest minds is not how to win arguments or improve social standing. It is simply how to refuse participation in emotional warfare. The drama will continue, the incompetence will persist, but your internal peace must become a private republic a space so rigorously defended from external expectations that no amount of noise, malice, or mundane frustration can breach its walls. Become the witness, and in being merely the witness, you achieve an unshakable form of freedom. We have journeyed far from the immediate shock of irritation through the meticulous archaeology of expectation and the discipline of mental rehearsal. We learned that much of what we deem disappointment is merely the collision between a fragile internal script and the messy, unpredictable reality of other human beings. But recognizing these patterns, even labeling them, still leaves us in the position of being reactive observers, analyzing the chaos rather than simply existing within it. There remains one final frontier to conquer, not merely managing our reactions to disappointment, but dismantling the emotional need for those others, our colleagues, friends, or distant acquaintances, to ever validate our internal peace. This is where we meet the Stoic shield. The concept at hand is often misunderstood as coldness, even bordering on indifference in the vulgar sense. Yet, to understand true philosophical tranquility, we must appreciate apatheia, a term frequently bastardized by modern tongues into merely apathy. To be free of passion does not mean to be unfeeling or emotionally sterile. It means being impervious, or rather, highly responsive only to what is fundamentally good and rational, while remaining utterly untouched by the storms of external opinion, fleeting favor, or interpersonal grievance. Apatheia is not emotional shutdown. It is intellectual sovereignty realized. Think of personal autonomy as a fortress. For years, we have been defending its walls against arrows fired from the mouths of others, criticism, neglect, misunderstanding. We've built ramparts of reason to withstand every potential slight, but even these ramparts can become tiring. They require constant vigilance, and frankly, they are exhausting. The Stoic shield teaches us that true power lies not in defending against external assault, but in adopting a posture of profound indifference toward the outcomes of our own efforts as dictated by others. This is the supreme act of withdrawal, not withdrawing physically, but emotionally. It is choosing to be self-contained, perfectly sufficient, and entirely indifferent to whether or not the world notices. This radical detachment must be understood as an embrace of power. It is the ultimate liberation. When we stop requiring others to fulfill a role for us, to admire our character, to treat us with consistent respect, to see the value in our presence, we instantly divest ourselves of their entire sphere of influence over our self-worth. Their opinion simply loses its anchor point within your internal landscape. The modern world, and perhaps civilization itself, runs on a currency of emotional expectation. We are constantly asked to be engaged, to maintain an aura of availability, to prove our relevance through visible concern or shared sentimentality. This cultural mandate for constant participation in the emotional economy is precisely what exhausts us and keeps us vulnerable to the sting of abandonment or slight. The wisdom here challenges that very premise that our value requires external confirmation. What if we were entirely self-sufficient in terms of spirit? What if our personal peace was not a tenuous gift bestowed upon us by kind colleagues, successful friendships, or appreciative strangers, but an innate state requiring nothing more than rational attention to one's own virtue? This is the transition from being nice, which requires giving energy and hope of reciprocation, to realizing that true excellence demands indifference. It is not enough merely to stop being angry when slighted. We must reach a point where others' actions simply register as neutral data points, much like watching birds fly overhead. They are facts of the environment, nothing more. Imagine yourself in an encounter, and instead of immediately asking, "What does this person need from me?" or "How will their action affect my reputation?" you ask a deeper question. Is my internal state predicated upon this interaction? Is my peace reliant on their goodwill? The immediate answer, repeated and deeply, is no. That inquiry alone cuts the energetic cord that binds your self-esteem to another person's fleeting mood or momentary judgment. The shield functions by accepting variability as law. It accepts that people are not widgets whose function can be optimized toward mutual contentment. They are complex systems of desire and habit, often operating with inherent irrationality and self-serving impulses. When you view their actions through this lens, not as a personal slight against your character, but merely as the inevitable overflow of their own internal turmoil, the emotional force field around them dissipates entirely. This is the power derived from recognizing that while we cannot control others' choice to be fickle, unkind, or distracting, we can achieve an immaculate separation between their behavior and our judgment. We practice a kind of radical self-containment. It does not feel breezy. It feels like gravity, the steady, inevitable force that holds you grounded regardless of the storm raging around you. The Stoic shield is thus built upon recognizing that human beings are primarily motivated by fear and desire for validation, and these motivators make them profoundly unreliable as anchors for our emotional lives. By embracing a functional indifference to their fluctuating states, we do not become heartless. Rather, we become masters of ourselves. This state is one of profound tranquility, a calm that doesn't arise from the absence of life or passion, but from the complete mastery over where those passions are directed. It is realizing that your inner life belongs solely to you. The external world, including all its frustrations and perceived letdowns, simply passes through, observed without attachment. This realization culminates in the quiet understanding. Our greatest victory is not mastering others' minds, but rendering their judgments incapable of disturbing the deep, unshakable sanctuary that resides within us. That citadel remains inviolate, a testament to an internal life finally free from the burden of constant expectation. We have spent much time mastering the judgment of others, recognizing that our inner peace is fundamentally unreachable if we believe external actions should align with our desires. We learn to draw boundaries around what belongs solely to us, our judgments, our assent, and thus our reaction. But true mastery is not merely about avoidance. It is a difficult art of engagement. How do we interact with the imperfect symphony of humanity without expecting perfection? This brings us to a paradox, one that seems contradictory to the very logic of self-mastery. What if kindness itself, the kindest act, is rendered worthless by an emotional attachment? What if our desire for reciprocation poisons the wellspring of virtuous action? We have practiced detaching ourselves from criticism and external approval. We have accepted the inevitability of misunderstanding, treating slights as mere weather patterns passing through us. But now we address a more subtle form of suffering, the disappointment that arises when we genuinely exert effort, when we choose to be good, patient, or helpful, and find that effort met with indifference, cruelty, or simply not the appreciation we anticipated. It is here, at this juncture between ethical intent and human reception, that our philosophy must deepen. The expectation of positive consequence following virtuous action is perhaps the most subtle trap of all. To be kind because you hope for gratitude, to offer help expecting acknowledgement, to extend patience, anticipating a reward. These are not acts of genuine virtue. They are transactions disguised as altruism. The moment we embed an emotional ledger into our benevolent actions, we make ourselves vulnerable once again, binding our inner state to the unpredictable whims of others. The paradox demands that we learn to act purely for the intrinsic value of the action itself, severing the invisible threads of reward and consequence. Consider a market square, humming with the low thrum of daily survival. Imagine offering genuine assistance, perhaps guiding a confused vendor, or sharing knowledge freely, not because you wish them well enough to deserve praise, but simply because your reason dictates that helping is its own fulfillment. When we strip away the expectation of thank you, or even at least some recognition, what remains is an untainted act of self-determination. Marcus Aurelius once wrote about the necessity of acknowledging fate's indifferent hand. He saw the universe as operating on a logic far grander and much less sentimental than human needs. If we model our interactions on this colossal indifference, two things happen. First, our expectations shrink dramatically. Second, our freedom expands immeasurably. This is not about becoming cold or unresponsive. It is about ensuring that our actions are never predicated on them. When the act of kindness ceases to be a means toward validating our own inner moral compass and becomes its end, a self-contained circuit of virtue completing itself, then we achieve genuine detachment. Think of an offering made in complete solitude, not because no one will see it, but because the sheer act of giving fully and without reservation is enough sustenance for the soul. This shifts the internal focus entirely. The question is no longer, what will they do with my grace? But rather, am I performing this action from a place of genuine self-discipline? This shift provides a profound buffer against disappointment. If our emotional investment is solely in the integrity of our asterisk intent, the pure commitment to acting rationally and virtuously, then external outcomes become irrelevant details, like passing cloud formations. Their indifference becomes simply data, not a verdict upon our character. We perform the effort, accepting that the receiving party may be emotionally unavailable, preoccupied with their own turmoil, or simply incapable of recognizing true virtue when they encounter it. They are struggling in their own invisible battlements, and your helpfulness might be merely background noise to their internal chaos. Recognizing this realization that we cannot control the depth of another's capacity for empathy, nor the trajectory of their self-absorption, is the ultimate act of emotional sovereignty. It is a form of proactive renunciation. We renounce the need for them to reflect our goodness. We simply accept that our inherent excellence is sufficient payment. This relinquishing makes us remarkably robust. The failure of others to appreciate your virtue does not diminish its existence or its value within you. It merely illuminates their own limitations, and recognizing those limitations with pity rather than anger becomes another subtle form of mastery. This paradox concludes that the most generous act we can perform for our own inner peace is to grant ourselves the grace of expecting nothing from others. We execute the effort, the kind word, the focused attention, the patient ear, purely because it aligns with reason's mandate, not because a future smile or acknowledgement promises to justify it. This unattached action is the final purification of the will, establishing that our self-worth is immutable, defined solely by the fidelity between our inner moral law and our outer conduct. Only when we operate from this ground can true freedom blossom. Freedom from need, freedom from fear, and freedom from the exhausting burden of emotional accounting. We have spent time, we've wrestled with the moment of frustration. We learned to separate our internal judgment from external events. We began to build that inner citadel, recognizing that much of our suffering is simply a result of faulty arithmetic. We are spending energy worrying about variables we cannot possibly control. But even mastering the micro-irritation of the passing annoyance or the cutting cue, it feels like merely containing the floodwaters in a small basin. The scope of human life, the sheer, messy expanse of collective human behavior, is vast and relentless. If we only address the fleeting slight, are we truly addressing the root instability? We must lift our gaze further. We must move past the immediate sting of the day's frustrations to see the long sweep of time itself. The deepest error in our philosophical journey has been mistaking momentary composure for ultimate wisdom. It is easy to be calm when only confronted by a petty slight, a careless word spoken in haste, or an unexpected failure of courtesy. Such moments provide a clean, contained test case. But human existence does not operate on the scale of a fleeting argument. It unfolds across generations, through cycles of ambition and decay, success and deep disappointment. To truly achieve unshakable peace, we must contextualize our struggles within something far grander than the self-inflicted wound or the neighbor's bad mood. This is where we confront what I call accepting human imperfection, not as a soft sentiment, but as an objective, cosmic law of entropy. We are not merely meant to tolerate others. We must understand that their very existence, their capacity for random folly, selfishness, and momentary cruelty is simply the predictable outflow of organic life, navigating flawed physical and moral architecture. Think of it in terms of time itself. The momentary annoyance vanishes with a breath. The slight from a colleague fades into memory. But human failing, the chronic inability to see oneself through another's eyes, the tendency toward tribal loyalty, even when unwarranted, the gravitational pull toward misunderstanding, these are deep patterns etched into the collective experience. We often react to these flaws as if they represent personal violations of sacred law, as though a person's petty greed or habitual thoughtlessness constitutes an act specifically designed to derail our internal order. This is the mistake of projection. We must learn to see it differently. We are not fighting individuals. We are struggling against the universal condition of being imperfectly human. The gossip that cuts deep today, the unreliable friend whose promises dissolve into ether, the colleague who acts solely for personal advancement, these are not failures of character alone. They are simply predictable points on the curve of fallible biology and flawed social structure. The goal is radical acceptance, accepting that entropy applies to virtue as much as it does to stone, that time degrades monuments, that distance dulls memory, and that even moral intentions fray under the constant friction of necessity and impulse. We cannot engineer away this inherent imperfection. It is woven into the very fabric of our biological mandate to exist in relation to others. To try and do so is to live in a perpetual state of philosophical rage against what must simply be asterisk. Consider the long arc of history, or even just the decades within one family line. You will observe patterns. The same temper flares up during periods of stress. The same misunderstanding repeats itself across generations with slightly different costumes. These repetitions are not moral failings unique to the individual. They are recurring signatures of a shared human condition, a deep-seated pattern of expectation, overextension, and eventual disappointment. The wise person who practices the long view does not merely endure these patterns, they model an emotional neutrality toward them. They observe the petty conflict in the market, not as evidence of personal inadequacy or injustice, but as a perfectly predictable skirmish between two minds struggling for limited resources, be those resources tangible, like coins, or intangible, like attention and respect. This perspective requires us to adopt a cosmic skepticism regarding value. We must cease elevating transient human achievements, momentary kindnesses, or public acclaim into the realm of permanent truth. When we realize that the perceived worth of another person, the way they treat you, the praise they bestow, the complaint they lodge against you, is subject to the same decay and capriciousness as a poorly constructed Roman aqueduct, our emotional investment shifts dramatically. They are fragile structures built on sand. This realization is not resignation. It is profound freedom. It is the acknowledgement that while we must continue to act virtuously, acting for intrinsic reward alone, understanding their inherent fallibility allows us to soften the edges of expectation. Instead of expecting people to behave as idealized philosophical models, as if they were statues crafted by an all-knowing artisan, we accept them as beings in perpetual beta testing, constantly glitching and updating without warning. Our greatest solace comes from this humility, realizing that we are part of the magnificent, messy experiment. We are not separated from the stream of common human frailty. Rather, our training allows us to flow within it with a sense of deep-seated detachment. The goal is simply to judge their actions by the standards of existence itself, that they were done under imperfect conditions by imperfect minds. And then, and only then, do we turn that observational lens inward, recognizing that our judgment, too, belongs to this vast, flawed spectrum and deserves just as much compassion and objective assessment. This is not weakness. It is the highest form of strength, the acceptance of reality in all its disappointing grandeur. We have traveled far from the acute sting of a misplaced word to the distant, vast comfort of acceptance. We began by wrestling with small moments, the hurried apology that rings false, the sudden dismissal, the careless glance that makes us feel unseen. These minor frictions, these little assaults on our expected social order, taught us nothing but the futility of trying to govern another soul. We learned that control is an illusion, a beautiful myth we cling to because the alternative, the recognition of true freedom, is too empty. And yet, the philosophical journey does not end with mere understanding. It must culminate in action. Understanding without application is merely decoration for the mind's drawing room. the wisdom gleaned from Epictetus and Seneca, the architectural principles derived from Marcus Aurelius' stillness, they are but tools awaiting a builder's hand. They demand nothing less than total recommitment to self. The final frontier of philosophy is not some grand theory or obscure treatise. It is the relentless, quiet policing of your own mind. It is choosing, moment by moment, where you will place your emotional allegiance. Until this internal republic is properly constituted, every external event, every passing slight, every unexpected failure, every moment of disappointing human folly will find purchase in your soul, creating debt and resentment. The challenge we face now is not one of intellect, but of habit. It requires a sustained state of vigilance. We must transition from the theoretical understanding of indifference to the visceral practice of emotional disengagement. This means recognizing that our greatest power lies precisely in what others are least equipped to predict. The consistency of our own reasoned response, the inner republic, is simply this. It is the commitment to judge only your own intent. It demands a profound shift from external accountability, the need for people to acknowledge your virtue, or forgive your mistakes, or meet you at the level of your expectation, to internal self-sufficiency. When we assume that our worth depends on the approval of another, we have surrendered the keys to our own fortress. We become emotional tenants in the lives of others, forever vulnerable to their eviction notices. The path forward, therefore, is one of radical ownership. It means accepting that some people will remain frustrating puzzles, sources of minor irritation, and occasional genuine pain. It requires acknowledging the universal human capacity for self-deception and inconsistency, not with judgment, but with a detached, scientific neutrality. We must stop viewing their flaws as personal attacks upon your character. Instead, we view them as inevitable symptoms, the predictable output of an unexamined life. The moment you achieve this detachment, something fundamental changes within you. You gain what the Stoics called freedom from dependence. Your peace ceases to be contingent on circumstance and becomes, finally, a direct product of your own judgment. This is not merely being nice. It is far deeper than that polite concession we make in the marketplace when things are convenient. It is an unshakable emotional integrity. Even when inconvenience, malice, or total failure presents itself before you. Imagine this capacity: to hear a vicious criticism delivered with casual venom, and instead of feeling the immediate, burning need to defend your reputation, that desperate scramble for validation, you feel only the calm recognition that their statement is merely a window into their own unsettled inner landscape. Their critique does not define your character, it merely illuminates theirs. You recognize the projection, the shadow play of someone else's unmet desires and insecurities, and you let it pass like smoke caught in a meaningless draft. This practiced indifference is not coldness, nor is it emotional absence. It is supreme clarity. It is the ability to operate with maximum effectiveness while maintaining zero emotional entanglement. It allows you to care deeply for justice or truth, yet remain utterly unaffected by who recognizes that justice or who fails to uphold the truth. The call to action, then, is continuous refinement. Philosophy is not a destination where we rest upon laurels of knowledge. It is an endless athletic regimen for the soul. You must return every single day, whether the world presents grand crises or merely mundane moments of annoyance, and ask yourself, what judgment am I attaching here that diminishes my freedom? Where am I assuming external control when I have none? Who needs to be validated right now? And most importantly, what do I truly value, the fleeting approval of a stranger, or the immutable peace secured by relentless self-mastery? The true philosopher understands that happiness is not found in the absence of trouble, but in the consistent reliability of their own reasoned internal state. It is the quiet triumph over the inner impulse to react defensively, to complain loudly, or to become entangled in another person's narrative of suffering or folly. It is the ultimate reclamation of self. You are the sovereign ruler of this single domain, your mind. Govern it with rigor. Accept life's messy entropy without demanding symmetry, and you will find that profound equanimity